portfolios that we have sort of comes together to achieve a common sort of objective. For me, the biggest challenge that we have is access to concessional finance and also access to the right technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I now turn to you, Espen, and ask you to introduce yourself and what do you think is the most important challenge that faces us?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mathur, and a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'm Espen Melum. I'm with the World Economic Forum's Energy and Materials platform, where I head our work on benchmarking and regional action. WEF is an international organization with a vision to improve the state of the world, working with many different stakeholders. In the carbon-constrained world we live in, there are of course many enablers that need to be aligned to quickly reduce emissions from energy. The availability of cost-competitive technology, of infrastructure, of affordable capital and demand. But personally, I will argue that policy is the single most important enabler, and that's so necessary to create the right incentive for systemic change. Back to you, AJ.
Thank you very much, Espen. So we see the importance of technology and finance. We see the importance of policy. Valerie, can I now turn to you?
Thank you. Happy to be with you today. Very excited to be part of that panel. I'm Valérie Besson. I'm partner of KPMG located in Paris, and I'm leading the activities for the E&R sector for the EMAS region. I've been serving large corporates both in oil and gas and power and utilities over my career at KPMG. And of this very broad topic today that we are discussing, I would like to focus on the need to accelerate innovation on clean energy to meet the global ambition on net zero emission.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thank you, Valerie. Can I now turn to Nitin? Nitin has been a friend for many years. He has chaired Shell in India for many years. Nitin, your introduction as well as your thoughts as we move ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, for the very warm welcome and a very good morning to everybody. My name is Nitin Prasad, and I'm the chairman for Shell, the Shell companies in India. Shell as an organization, we have, of course, we are in and have historically been in the fossil fuel business, but we have been quite committed to the transition and becoming a net zero organization by 2050 and reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. Quite key in this one is also our commitment to do this on not only on scope 1, scope 2, but also scope 3, which is of course our suppliers and our customers' emissions. In that same spirit, what I think is the big challenge is to meet the agreed goals for COP26. I think it's very fundamental that the world has to change the way that it uses energy. And in that, I think it's really important that we develop the new integrated pathways and solutions to come back and define how that energy needs to come back and be created across the low carbon solutions, from hydrogen to CCUS, NBS to materials and so forth. And so I think it's really important that there's a collaborative solution building between all players in the value chain, but equally a credible and coherent policy framework that backs the journey as we go forward.
Thanks very much, Nitin. I think the issue of collaborative solution building is clearly at the heart of how we move ahead. Mohit, you come from NTPC, a major electricity producer. Where do you see yourself? But before that, it would be great if you can introduce yourself at NTPC as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks, Dr. Mathur. I'm Mohit Bhargav. I head the renewable vertical at NTPC. NTPC, as Dr. Mathur mentioned, is the largest supplier of electricity in India. Almost a quarter of the electricity supplies in the country is made by NTPC. So, and we have an installed capacity base of close to 67 gigawatts The major thing which we're trying to do is to transition from being a primarily fossil fuel-based entity into an entity which is also having almost an equal share of the non-fossil based capacity. So we have set for ourselves a target of achieving 60 gigawatts of renewable capacity in the next 10 years. What this will mean is that our renewable portfolio or the non-fossil portfolio would be almost equal in size to the fossil portfolio. And going forward, of course, we'll be reducing this even further. When we talk about transition pathways, energy transition is upon us, and NTPC is also part of that. India is part of that. World has set for itself targets at COP26. So one of the important things we feel is that electricity has to be at the center of energy transition. And we have to ensure that electricity becomes the most predominant forms of energy, because it's actually much more easier to clean and decarbonize electricity as an energy source, which can then be used to do anything and everything which we need to do. So whether it's mobility, whether it's use in industries. So if we use green electricity to produce hydrogen, so we are decarbonizing a whole set of industries. If we are using green electricity for powering homes, powering mobility, powering heating, cooling, and all these solutions. So for us, putting electricity at the center of energy transition and aggressively pursuing renewable energy or green sources of energy is what we need to do.
Thanks, Mohit. I think you're spot on. Green electrification is at the heart. Even if you go to the hydrogen way, we are looking at green electricity and splitting water to make hydrogen. I think we are looking forward to a fascinating discussion here, all the way from the larger country level issues of technology and finance that Mr. Mustafa talked about, to the issue of policy intervention that Espen talked about, to the need to accelerate innovation that Valerie spoke, to the need for collaborative solutions, as Nitin mentioned, and as Mohit said, green electrification. I'm not going to ask each of our panelists to say in a little more detail what are the kinds of challenges, and hopefully also how do we overcome them. Mr. Mustafa, all yours. And I would like each one of us to limit ourselves to somewhere around 5 minutes, so that after that we can have time for both an interaction between the panel as well as to take on questions from the audience. Mr. Mustafa, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mathur. As you know, Maldives is one of the most vulnerable countries to the projected impacts of climate change. And therefore, we feel that we have the obligation to demonstrate to the world that a sustainable path is possible. Sustainable development path is possible. That's the reason why the government of Maldives has set a net zero ambition by 2030, way ahead of the rest of the world. We know this is challenging. We know as a developing small island state, this could be a massive challenge for us, because we don't have the necessary finances. We don't have the right technologies with us at the moment. But we are investing, we are focusing on the technologies that we know, the technologies that we have access to finance at the moment. The government of Maldives has set a very ambitious plan to roll out renewable energy nationwide. When we started, we started with basically nothing. But as I speak today, we have installed almost 30 to 40 megawatts of solar photovoltaics in Maldives. We are hoping to, but within next 1.5 years, we are hoping to extend this to about 50 megawatts by 2030. This, when I say this may not be a big amount for a large country like India or even Sri Lanka, but for us, the peak demand here in Maldives is, when we combine all inhabited islands, is around 300 megawatts. So for us to install 30 megawatts and with the limited resources we have is a big achievement. And as I speak, there are smaller islands in Maldives where we can shut down the diesel generators during the daytime because it is solely run on solar photovoltaics during daytime. Of course, these islands are not many at the moment, but our plan is to have these the success stories replicated in and throughout the Maldives. And the challenge that we have as a small island country is space constraints. Yeah. Our islands are small. We have very limited roof space available, and on land, virtually we have no land for any large scale solar investments. But what we do have is like lagoons and shallow water lagoons, where there's immense potential for floating solar investments. But I know the technology is still, as a growing, and there have been a very successful installations elsewhere in the world, and we hope to, replicate those successes here in Maldives. Therefore, we have announced tenders for floating solar in megawatt scale, about 10 megawatt recently. And the other area that we are investing is battery storage. We understand that for intermittent power to be fed into the grid, for stability and other reasons, we need battery. Without batteries, we cannot go for large scale investments in solar. So that is an area where we invest in as well. The other area is also smart grids. We haven't done much on this front, but we are investing in energy management systems and rehabilitating our existing grids. And we are also planning to install, roll out smart meters and phase out old electromechanical meters that are used currently in the country. So these are basically the areas that we are focusing. And also, right now I've just mentioned about the power generation, but Maldives is, because of the way geographically our islands are spread out, the transport sector consumes almost equal amount of power, energy. So unfortunately, again, for transport, there is limited options for us to consider, but we are also exploring electronic e-mobility both on land as well as on the sea. These are the main areas we are focusing. But again, the biggest challenge for us is, of course, access to concessional finance and also access to emerging new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa. And Ajwad, if I will come back to you, and I want to unpack some of the issues that you raised. I think the technology part is very, very clear. And we also have with us Mohit from NTPC, who has been pushing. They've installed a large amount of floating solar. And I particularly don't look at Maldives as a small island state, but as a large ocean state. So clearly, floating solar is important, but you're absolutely right. Technology is at the heart. And even behind technology, there is the issue of finance. And as we move towards replacing the current technologies, the issue of the affordability becomes important. And I think, therefore, the question becomes, how on earth do we enable technology and finance to come in at prices that people can afford and at time scales that make sense to the world? Espen, let me now turn to you. You have highlighted the importance of policy. What kinds of things, for example, can the Maldives do to attract the technology and finance? Or maybe I'm stealing your thunder. Espen, it's all yours.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I can answer that question, but let me develop a bit and then come to the point of policy. And energy is, of course, a very positive thing. Let's not forget that. We all depend on it, right? It's around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions from energy production and consumption. That is the problem that we're trying to solve for here. Energy transition is not only about the supply sectors, but as much about the energy use sectors like heavy industries, transportation, and IT. So it's systemic change that we're trying to do here. And at the macro level, I would say it's actually pretty clear what we need to do to decouple energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions is electrifying what can be electrified. This was mentioned. Clean the electrons, of course, shifting from coal to renewables or using gas or nuclear as a bridge where that's required. Clean the molecules as well through CCS and hydrogen. Push the pedal on energy efficiency and innovate faster. And I would say in recent years and at the COP26, we have seen some very positive developments. Of course, many companies and countries, including the major economies, have committed to net zero. And with COP, we also saw this commitment to 1.5 degrees, a phase down of coal, and the financial sector really setting higher levels of ambition. And we also see, I think, AJ, really companies and countries stepping up not only ambition, but also action towards net zero individually and collectively. 3 quick examples. On the renewable side, we have the RE100 with over 300 companies committing to move towards 100% renewable electricity, and the International Solar Alliance that you lead, for instance. On the hard-to-abate sector, we see the Mission Possible partnership really working through this sector to see what can be done to get on a journey towards net zero. And on technology, the first mover coalition announced at COP by the World Economic Forum and the US is really serving as a platform to jumpstart some of these technologies that we have talked about here, AJ. But I think also the last years has shown how hard it is to put emissions into structural decline. So last year emissions went down by about 6% due to the COVID shock, but they will increase about as much this year. And the forum's Global Energy Index also shows that there's slow progress in the last decade overall on energy systems for countries. And why is this so complex, and why can policy help? Not only do we need to invest in new clean energy capacity, but we must also transition existing infrastructure before it has reached the end of its economic lifetime. And the biggest clean energy investment needs are in emerging and developing economies where the cost of capital is much higher than in advanced economies. And let's not forget that energy transition is not only about sustainability, but also about affordability and security. And that's where policy, I think, is the single most important factor that can help accelerate things. And let me maybe end by giving 4 brief examples of that. First, on carbon pricing at levels that matter without killing economic growth. I think the EU with the ETS scheme and countries like Sweden are showing the way here. But currently only 15% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing. Second, I think we need to broaden incentives for renewables, such as targets, auctions, and regulations like allowing corporate purchase of renewables, spreading that across more countries. India and Chile, for instance, are among the leaders here, but we need to broaden the renewables scaling. Third, incentivizing electromobility, where my home country, Norway, is one of the front runners. 80% of car sales the last month was electric there, and wouldn't be possible without policy. And last, we need to create incentives for companies to innovate. And I think the EU Green Deal and related measures is one example that push companies to innovate. So that's why policy matters. And of course, good policy needs to be coherent and effective, both from an economic, climate, and energy transition perspective. That's not easy, but it is possible. Back to you, Ajay.
Thank you very much, Espen. And when we come back, I want to again discuss this in greater detail. What are the kinds of policy tools that can help developing countries in general? And I ask this because till today, we do not have a cost-effective technology to provide renewable electricity at night. When the sun is not shining, how on earth do you get adequate electricity? And that's true across the world. And so is carbon pricing a good enough tool, or do we need something else? I will come back to that. But Valerie, you have spoken about innovation in clean energy. You're absolutely right, and it goes back to Mr. Mustafa's point, Ajot's point, that technology and the right technologies are important for the right people. Could you explain us on the issue of innovation a wee bit more?
Yes, thank you, Ajay. So first of all, I would like to say that we are going through incredibly exciting times in the energy sector, in an environment where the demand for energy keeps growing, with growing demographics, better access to energy, notably due to new technologies. Decarbonizing the energy is part of the solution to fight global warming. So the energy sector is clearly the place to be, and within our KPMG Global Network, there is not a single day where we do not receive questions from other sector industries who are willing to decarbonize their operations. So we all know, and we've already discussed about the various pathways or angles of attack to decarbonize. First, transforming the energy supply, transforming the energy mix, and moving from the fossil era to the electrification era, with the rise of renewable electricity and dominated by solar and wind. We've discussed already on that. And secondly, improving energy efficiency. So going through that massive transformation, the industry is facing a number of challenges. One, the availability and the accessibility of energy, securing the energy system, making sure that the intermittency of the renewable energies is compensated through storage solution and the energy mix, for instance, affordability of energy, we will tackle on that. New technologies developed for clean energy need to be competitive, and acceptability, making sure that the new technologies developed do not impair substantially the environment and the ecosystem or the end consumers. See, for instance, all the debates around the wind farm implementation in certain territories. So the key ingredients, enablers for such a successful transformation are innovation, technology in clean energy, and the need to accelerate to reach the net zero ambition goals, the necessary support of policies and regulations we just talked about, and without forgetting, of course, the financing aspect of it. So, as indicated earlier, in an environment where the demand for energy continues to grow, there is no other choice than keeping innovating into new technologies for cleaner energies. And in our recent KPMG CEO Energy Outlook, we revealed that in that respect, there is a strong sense of optimism in the sector around tech innovation and the impact to come, which is very good news. So 86% of the energy CEOs interviewed see technological disruption as more of an opportunity than a threat. And rather than waiting to be disrupted by competitors, 81% of them indicated that their organization is actively disrupting the sector in which they operate. So one thing is sure, the technology in use today can deliver large amounts of the emission reduction, but they are not sufficient on their own to bring the world to net zero while ensuring the energy systems remain secure. So accelerating the energy innovation is key, and in that respect, I would say that there is half of the cumulative emission reduction moving the world onto a sustainable trajectory is coming from four main technology approach: the electrification of end-use sectors, heating and transport, for instance, the application of carbon capture, utilization and storage, the use of low-carbon hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuel, and the use of bioenergy. A large portion of emissions will require the use of new technology, and much of these emissions come from sectors where the technology options for reducing them are limited, and this is the case for shipping, truck, aviation, and heavy industries, steel, cement, chemicals. So decarbonizing this sector will largely demand the development of new technology, not yet in use. And many of the clean energy technologies available today need more work to bring down costs and accelerate deployments. So accelerating the innovation in clean energy technology implies the mobilization of a wide range of participants, public, private sectors, not-for-profit research institution, funders, and actually you mentioned earlier the collaboration. Collaboration is key in driving the industry's focus on new technologies. And actually in our survey, it revealed that 59% of CEOs are planning to join industry consortia focused on development of innovative technologies. And I would say that government also have a pivotal role going for far beyond simply funding research and development. So yes, we are living exciting times, but we are racing against the clock, and the pace of innovation in clean energy needs to be accelerated.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I think that was a very valid point. At COP26, what excited me was this was the first COP where the number of coalitions that were being developed outside the negotiating room took the center stage rather than the text-based negotiations inside the rooms. You're also right that we are seeing a lot of company-based coalitions coming together. But I'd like to come back to you with the question of who funds this innovation. With companies, it's okay. But if you're looking at Maldives, for example, there are a number of applications. Let's say floating solar. Where will this innovation come from? But before we do that, let me turn to Nitin. Nitin, Valerie has already started the discussion on one approach to enabling innovation, which is what you spoke about, the collaborative solution building for batteries, for PVs, for hydrogen, for CCUS. Can you tell us a little more about how you are thinking of collaborative solution building?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mathur. And let me sort of frame my comments a little bit. I think suffice it to say, all of us would come back and understand that India is well on track to achieve its Paris Agreement targets. And then the Honorable Prime Minister made quite a strong and a bit surprising commitment for many in terms of India being a net zero by 2070. I think the first thing where I want to start is how do we sort of see that, right? And I would sort of suggest that is a very strong commitment, and India has a very strong track record of meeting its commitment, but it certainly should not be the ambition. And ambition, in my mind, is still should be more aggressive, and we should continue to take a look at a 2050 timeline. Certainly for corporates across the board. If we are not looking at a more aggressive 2050 timeline, we are at risk of not being globally competitive in an emerging, low carbon economy in the manufacturing world as we go forward. And this is a quite an important point. Now, Dr. Mathur, in collaboration with your sort of alma mater, we had done the scenarios as to what a 2050 could actually look like for India. And very sort of insightful in terms of what came out, because very much the suggestion was that India has some fairly unique dynamics in terms of where the emissions pathways are going to come back and go. And two that are the most prevalent are, of course, mobility and industrial. And from mobility, it was fairly straightforward. It goes down to zero, and there's credible pathways and plenty of work to get us down there in a reasonable time frame. Industrial activity, although I think was more interesting, because the net conclusion that we came back in conjunction with Terry was that we cannot get to zero in the industrial activity. And if you take a look at about 1.2 gigatons of emissions that India emits today, what we actually see is that despite the amount of industrial activity increasing, tripling over the next 3 decades, to build out the infrastructure that we need in the country, the actual amount of emissions would actually largely stay flat, about 1.2 to 1.3 gigatons even in 2050. Now, I want to focus on that sector a little bit and dive that to the next level of detail. And maybe I'll add to the comments that Valerie had sort of come back and said in innovation, and maybe come back and suggest that innovation, in my mind, is in 3 areas in that space, because these companies and sectors, as they are going forward, frankly, the infrastructure has not even been built yet. We need, tripling of cement plants, tripling of steel plants, and all that has to be built. And we do not need to go down the technological pathways of other countries in building out this particular sort of infrastructure. What's key, I think, in innovation is we largely know that if you take a look at a system level thing, what are the solutions that we all want to take a look at? CCUS, hydrogen, renewables, storage back, et cetera, right? What is key, I think, is three things. One, the pace of the innovation. Many of the technologies are at a low TRL level. It's not as if we don't know what they can do for us. It's just that they are not yet commercially ready. And that means that we have to take them through an accelerated journey for technologies that have traditionally taken 30 years of development to get from concept to commercialization. We need to do this in less than half the time to take that forward. So the pace of technological development and innovation and how we accelerate that pace is very important. The second innovation is in the integration of these technologies. We are fundamentally changing some heavy process-oriented industries that have been delicately developed and balanced over decades. And coming back and suggesting that we are going to make them flexible with multiple sources and redesign the systems. And they have been economically optimized to such a high degree that even things like, what are some of the byproducts have utilization basis, what do we do with each of these things? We have to go through that journey with the new process. So it's not just about injecting hydrogen into a blast furnace and everyone can smile and say, well, we're done. Well, actually, there's byproducts that come from that. What do we do with the byproducts? How do we actually utilize that? How do we generate the hydrogen? There's lots of other questions that come in terms of designing these new heavy feed process industries. So the integration and the combination of all these clean energy, low emission technologies is equally important as we go forward. And the third area, which you've also touched on, Dr. Mathur, is of course the demand side and the customer side. Because if we do not engage the consumers and the customers further downstream in an adoption of these green technologies, and frankly recutting the economics value chains that have existed for a long time, well, then we're going to find that parts and sectors are going to actually fundamentally break down. Because it is going to be more expensive potentially for a steel or for a cement company to be able to produce that. But yes, by the time you get down to a building, a platinum LEED building, how much of that cost, the platinum LEED cost, is a commercial realty cost is the green cement versus non-green cement. It's a small fraction. So how do you share that, and how do you sort of bring that consistency across on the demand side all the way to the consumer back through is effectively an innovation in new value chains and creation of new circular approaches and economic structures. So in my mind, I think this is the essence of the collaborative opportunity that comes and exists to take the three aspects I spoke about: the pace of technology development, the integration of multiple technologies, and the bringing the consumer demand side and the demand drivers.
Thank you very much, Nitin. I also noted the establishment of the First Movers Coalition at Glasgow, which commits to buying the green steel or the green cement, even if it may cost a little bit more. That creates the confidence to invest in both the innovation as well as in the technology manufacturing. But what really interested me was the question that you had on the second one, which is on integration. And I'll come back to you with a focus on that. How do you enable integration? Because integration is ultimately at the level of applications.
Yep.
And yes, demand helps. Are there other things that we need to do? Mohit, let me now turn to you. You mentioned that you have 67 gigawatts of coal-based generation, or nearly 67 gigawatts of coal-based generation, and you're looking at building up 60 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. What are the internal challenges that you face? But let me turn it over to you. Mohit, all yours.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just a small correction. We don't have 67 gigawatts of coal base.
Yeah.
It's a total capacity.
I realize that.
So the coal based capacity is closer to 55, and rest of course is we have hydro and other sources also. Yeah, but the challenges are innumerable because starting from the supply chain to the funding to the off-taking. So all these, and of course, in the case of India, availability of land, availability of evacuation infrastructure. So all these are challenges which any developer like us will have to face. And typically in the case of NTPC also, the issue is that we are now actually in a market-facing situation, which was not in the case of the coal-based situation. So that apart. But I just wanted to touch upon the points made by the other panelists, and when we talk about innovation, we talk about financing, we talk about technology. So I just wanted to mention here that in India, when we started renewables maybe 10 years ago, a decade ago, from there to where we are now, we have done over 100 gigawatts of variable renewables, 150 gigawatts of non-fossil, including renewable and large hydro. So if I look only at the variable renewable, we did 100 gigawatts in 10 years, and we plan to do close to 500 gigawatts in the next decade. How did this happen? So some of the things which the government did and which probably are in a way kind of reform or policy. One, of course, was bidding at a central level. Second was having an intermediary procurer to de-risk the developers. Third was, waiving of the transmission charges for all such of these projects. So even though a lot of people keep saying that waiving of the transmission charges led to a disruption, but ultimately it also led to a situation where the off-taker or the buyer is getting power at a cost which is on the renewable side today almost comparable and going forward lower than what he would have got otherwise. So these are some of the innovations which the government did. Putting in an intermediary procurer allowed the developer not to deal directly with, for example, the state discoms. They could deal with the central agency, so the payment risk was taken care of. And so technology innovation started happening on its own. I mean, all this situation, what I just wanted to make a small point was, the technology started happening on its own. So people moved from a 330 watt peak module to a 500 watt peak module. They're now moving on to bifacials. And going forward, if we are able to get the right prices even for the higher efficiency modules, that will also start happening. Similarly, on the wind side, the size of the turbine moved from 500 kilowatt to 800 kilowatt to 1.5 megawatt to now 3.3 megawatt. So all this is happening because there was demand. So when we talk about accelerating the decarbonization, accelerating energy transition, it's important to have a market to create a demand. And for a market, I don't necessarily mean a market like we have a totally open market necessarily, but a market which is built as per the requirements of the situation. So if we are able to create demand, which we did in the case of renewables, similar market can be created, for example, for green hydrogen, which will accelerate energy transition, not only for the power sector, it will accelerate energy transition for various other industries like mobility, like refineries, like fertilizers, steel, cement, going forward even for aviation. This will enable availability of hydrogen or ammonia, and I'm talking green in all these cases, at a very, very competitive rate. The biggest challenge, sir, which you mentioned was today is, for example, when I'm moving forward on the RE and the hydrogen side, the biggest challenge on the hydrogen ammonia side is the cost. So if I am comparing the cost of green hydrogen with the conventionally available hydrogen, obviously no one's willing to buy. So carbon markets could probably help, but we also need to ensure that there is enough push on the policy side by the government to keep this moving forward. While listening to Mr. Mustafa, one of the points he made was about, island state, which you refer to as ocean state. So diesel is the way they're going now, and probably it's the cheapest alternative. What we are looking at is if we are able to provide green ammonia, which will replace diesel totally. Green ammonia will have to be manufactured at either of the mainlands, which is closer to Maldives. It could be India or any other location. So green ammonia used to fire your small gas turbines or other equipments will provide you totally green power, and that will take care of you not having enough land parcels to set up these large capacities. So these are typical solutions. I don't know whether these are innovative, but these are already available to us. Floating solar in India, we are the largest, doing the largest number of floating solar panels. But there are again costs involved, and of course there are technological challenges on how you develop these floating solars. The other part with intermittency, Dr. Mathur mentioned earlier, with renewables, yes, it is there. But if we are looking at round-the-clock power solutions, so we have storage now, whether this is battery storage, pump storage, compressed air storage, or even gravity storage. So people are innovating a lot. We have been offered solutions from across the world. We're looking at solar thermal, we're looking at a gravity, and variety of others. And even in battery, the challenges or the technology changes which are happening from lithium ion to the flow batteries to sodium sulfur batteries. All these are options which will not only elongate the life of the battery, will make it many more cycles would be available. And these can be very easily integrated to supply round-the-clock power. Recently, there was a bid, you might have seen, sir, where the price has been much lower. Of course, that was with thermal. But we are quite hopeful that in the next 3 years, with good storage solutions, with more economic storage solutions, fully RE-based round-the-clock power would be competitive with coal-based power. It's quite possible because India remains one of those locations where renewable resources are abundant. We have access to a good, cheap cost of capital. We have access to, with the government's thrust on moving towards more and more domestic manufacturing, that will also start happening. So we look at, in terms of acceleration, a couple of various options, if I may use the word. One, of course, is green hydrogen and green ammonia. In fact, one of the pilots we're trying to do is to produce green methanol. So that's capturing carbon dioxide and using green hydrogen to create green methanol. Now, green methanol is nothing else but fuel. So we are actually able to produce green fuel. If we, on the other option, if we start actually blending green hydrogen with natural gas, and I believe in the UK already more than 10% is being done. So we are actually reducing the carbon footprint of natural gas. So it's greening that. Another pilot we have started, another project we started in Varanasi is to convert municipal solid waste into green charcoal. And you were there in one of the juries, we had done a hackathon for green charcoal. So that is green fuel. We are using municipal solid waste. And this is not a very large rocket science kind of technology. It's a very simply available technology. We only need to ensure that it's doable. So we're going to do that. So these are the options. And if we are able to green the fuel, if we are able to create storage, so we are looking, and I'm not talking about steel and all these industries who can use green hydrogen and green ammonia as it comes. So we are looking at a very strong option to green the entire value chain.
Thank you very much, Mohit. I think there are 2 points that I think are amazingly important. One, of course, you emphasized the importance of demand, as did Nitin. But I think the important issue also is looking at innovative solutions like green ammonia. And the other important point that you made was the finite time frame. I think you said 3 years, but I say anywhere between 3 and 5 years, that round the clock electricity from renewables would be cost competitive with coal-based electricity. Before I come back to each one of you, and I know, Mohit, it's unfair, but you are looking at a solution for Maldives. Now, Maldives doesn't have an NTPC. How on earth does it do the technological innovation that is needed? But I'll come back to that. Meanwhile, let me turn to Anish. And Anish, if you can tell us 3 questions, we'll ask the panelists to respond to them.
Sure, Dr. Mathur. So first question is about COP26. What did it achieve and what did it not? So that's a broad one in this context. The second one is on marine ecosystems. What will be the effect of solar power plants on marine ecosystems? And I suppose that's more to Ajbad. The third question is on how would carbon pricing advance the decarbonization journey substantially? These are three questions I picked up first. I have some more.
Okay, many thanks. I'm going to now turn back to the panelists. I obviously have very strong feelings on each one of them, but I don't think that's what the audience wants. Espen, let me start with you. Take one or three, all three questions. Let's start with COP26. What did you think it achieved and what did you think it did not achieve?
Well, there were very high expectations for this COP, and personally, I think it really achieved a commitment to the 1.5 degrees instead of the below 2 degrees. I think also the first time the coal issue was really on the agenda, and it was phasing down of coal in the end, but not phasing out. But it's a step in the right direction. After all, coal is a really big issue, and I think it also really cemented this kind of bottom-up approach. So it's not only about the nation states committing. We see some kind of upping on the game there, but we really saw the bottom-up companies and coalitions of stakeholders committing to different things and taking action. And the first mover coalition there that was mentioned here was one of those things. I think the Glasgow Financial Alliance is another one. 130 trillion of US dollar of capital committed to net zero. So it's a number of things like this. But of course, we're not there yet in terms of turning all these willingness and ambitions into the actions that can really put emissions on the credible path towards net zero. So that's, I think, what it did not achieve. Should I stop there, AJ?
Sure. So let me move the next question to you, Nitin. Shell has been working in marine ecosystems for a very long time. So before I turn over to Ajwal, let me ask you, what do you need to put in place to ensure that the impact of the new energy systems on the marine ecosystems are either zero or minimized?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mathur. So in answering your question, we do a tremendous amount of work, and a couple of key things on this one is one, how much do you the need to collaborate with a number of specialists in this thing, so whether it's marine biologists or whether it's farmers or fishermen and other sort of relevant stakeholders who have a clear view on the marine ecology and what actually happens. Case in point, in many cases when we've talked about subsea lines, we have discovered, for example, things like whales migration, that cut across them, and what's the implications, from having these artificial, shall I call it, structures, being built in the subsea waters. All of this takes a tremendous amount of cooperation, collaboration, and working together to come back and sort out. There is a lot of learnings, I think, and I think that is what you're referring to as in terms of the amount of subsea work that we kind of come back and do. And I think it's about recognizing and taking some of those things forward, which is why you see a number of that is being used by a number of governments in offshore wind, for example, which is a bit more challenging, I think, in some cases than solar. On offshore solar, I think the one thing that we have to be incredibly conscious about is one, the movement, and how is that actually going to come back and think, and to also recognize that there is a benefit from the sun hitting the water, right? So what are we actually displacing from doing that? It's equivalent to the same sort of thing that we talked about when in the bio world about doing things in a way that recognizes in arable land and not agricultural land and so forth. So we're going to have to come back and make similar sort of choices about spaces that are more fit for those solutions than otherwise.
Thank you, Nitin. Ajwal, let me throw this question at you. Are you apprehensive that the energy systems of tomorrow may adversely impact the marine ecosystem?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Certainly, I mean, the laws of, the Maldives, with any development project, the project has to undergo environmental impact assessments. And there's no exception for even for large scale floating solar projects. We have to do environmental and social safeguard process. One of the concerns that we have in Maldives is ideally, a tourist destination. Our islands, the beaches, and the lagoons, and the ocean is that is what the tourists are coming to see. So, I mean, if we utilize all the lagoons for large scale floating solar, how would that impact, the perception of tourists? Would they see as a Maldives as a green destination, or would they see Maldives as something else? So those are the concerns. And again, and as the other concern we have is, with floating solar is, of course, what would be the impact on the marine environment? The corals the underneath, and the seagrass, for example, and the rich biodiversity that lives in our coral reefs. So, I mean, we haven't done much analytical work on this front, and I think we would need definitely a technical support in assessing the potential environmental impacts, how to mitigate and minimize those impacts with regard to large scale floating solar. And the same concern we have even with batteries, battery storage. Ultimately, with the period of time, we need to replace it. How do we deal with, the batteries that are used in large scale battery storage? So these are some of the environmental concerns that we have. But I'm sure with the right mitigation measures, there will be ways that we can address these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajwal. We come to the third question, which is on how far can carbon pricing advance the transition or accelerate the transition? Valerie, is there some work that you have done on carbon pricing and what it does to innovation, what it does to the pickup of new technologies?
What I can say is that, of course, it's a great tool to fight carbon emissions. So it's a tool used by governments in their package. It's a tool which is also used by corporates in their roadmap to decarbonization. Internally, there are corporates who use that carbon pricing to set their target and to measure how far they go in terms of measuring the target. So it's clearly a tool to identify the climate risk and measure the revenue opportunities as well for corporates.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Mohit, I'm turning to you. As a corporate, what do you see as both the advantages and also, may I push, the challenges of a carbon tax?
I think that's a difficult one to answer right away because, yes, carbon pricing will definitely accelerate, although I do agree with Valerie that it's difficult to assess the rate and the impact it will have immediately, but probably in the longer term. But of course, if you look at the CDM mechanism, it really did not take off, but maybe with the carbon pricing things, hopefully we'll have learned the lessons and it will be much more organized in terms of how this will impact. Challenges will be there, and particularly in the case of India, it becomes very important, and that was also one of the key points on which the COP26 text lingered on beyond the stipulated deadline. So there's a very common thing going around now that no power is costlier than no power. So that's something which probably everyone started saying. And it's imperative in the case of countries like ours and China and a lot of other countries where it's important that we need to provide electricity. So the carbon pricing would ultimately have an economical impact. So while it will impact one side, it will also maybe have some kind of a negative impact on the other side. But all in all, we feel that carbon pricing is probably important to take things forward.
Thank you very much. I had umpteen questions to the panel, but we have run out of time. We need to close. I think it's better to close on a positive note with questions looking ahead rather than a long discussion at the end of which we are all cynical about how we move ahead. But I think we have had an interesting discussion. Ajwant made the point about the technology and access to finance. I think that is at the heart of the transition. Now, in doing so, we need policy. And I think one of the next items that we'll have to focus on, what are the kinds of policies that will let technology and finance flow into a country like Maldives. But I think Espen's focus on the issue of the right policies is at the heart of how do we make this change towards the new technology and new finance flowing into cleaner energy transitions. We also noted that apart from policy, innovation was important. We also noted that collaborative solution building for innovation was important, not just at the technology development level, but as both Valerie and Nitin said, at the level of deployment as well. And I think Nitin's point and Mohit's point on demand was amazingly important. It is actually the beginning of demand that then leads to innovation, that then leads to a change in policy. Otherwise, why on earth would the policymaker change if he or she does not see benefits flowing out of it? And finally, we note that a company like NTPC, which is in a sense representing the entrenched vested interest, is now becoming the entrenched vested interest for solar or for renewables. That by itself is amazing. It's amazing both for NTPC, it's amazing both for Shell. I think these kinds of changes in the corporate world are what provides us with the hope that we will move to a zero carbon future. With that, let me thank each one of you for your participation, for this extensive and good debate that we have had, and may I wish everybody an extremely bright future, which is carbon-free and which happens soon. Thank you all very, very much. Anish, back to you.
Thank you, and thank you to you, Dr. Mathur, and to the panel for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
The world has changed, and it's not just because of COVID. Consumers and employees have increasingly different expectations of the world and the businesses they buy from and work for. Your shareholders and lenders are under pressure from regulators and the market to prove that they're acting responsibly and investing sustainably. All will be making choices about which organisations they work with. So will yours be one of them? Each stakeholder looks at your business through their own lens, and this is your opportunity to choose what's behind it. What is your impact on our planet? What do you contribute to the communities you operate in? And how do you conduct yourself? ESG